Hey, little buddies, it's Uncle Rick from the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club, home of some of the greatest books ever written for American kids. And today I am reading from The True Story of George Washington by Elbridge S. Brooks. If you've listened to very many of my audiobooks, you'll know that I'm a big fan of Elbridge Brooks. And today we're reading about one of the greatest of all great Christian Americans, George Washington. So let's jump right in here. This is chapter 4 in The True Story of George Washington. It's called Colonel Washington of Mount Vernon. The brave man, like the boy who is really brave, does not rush blindly into danger. But if he is brought face to face with it, he acts boldly and quickly. This was Washington's way. He had been victorious in the little fight which he had been forced to make, but he knew that if more fighting were to follow, as he felt sure it would, he must stand his ground firmly and try to hold his own. "I will not be surprised," he wrote to the governor of Virginia, begging for the soldiers that had been promised him, "and you may hear that I am beaten. But you will hear at the same time that we have done our duty in fighting as long as there was a shadow of hope." These were brave words for a young leader in the strait in which he found himself. But it was George Washington's way of doing things all through his life. A few more soldiers were sent to him, and with these troops and his Indian helpers he marched on to meet the French. With the new men came the news that Colonel Fry, who was to lead them, was dead. Washington was therefore in chief command of his little army. He was Colonel Washington now. After he had marched through the mountains, he heard that the Frenchmen, 1,000 strong, were moving towards him. He was in no safe place to give them battle, so he fell back to Great Meadows and finished a hastily made fort of logs and dirt, which he well named Fort Necessity. "If they wish a battle, let them have it now," he said, and throwing open the door of his flimsy little fort, he marched with his men out into the open meadow, daring the Frenchmen to fight. But they did not accept his double dare. Instead, they stayed in the woods and fired at the Americans, not showing themselves where they could be fought openly. So Washington marched back into the fort again, and for 9 hours the Frenchmen battered and besieged it. Then they sent word to Washington that it was of no use for him to hope to whip them, as they had 4 times as many men as he had, and everything was in their favor. "Give us the fort," they said. "Return the prisoners you've taken. Promise not to build any more forts around here for a year, and we'll call it square. Let you go home without any more fighting." Washington hated to agree to this, but when he came to look things over and see how useless it was for him to try to beat the French with his men half starved, his powder gone, and his Indian helpers running away, he remembered the old proverb that says the better part of valor is discretion. So he agreed to the French terms, and on the 4th of July gave up his crazy little fort and marched back toward home. He had been defeated, but he was by no means conquered. Still, he felt very badly over the way things had turned out. If the help that had been promised him had only been given, he would perhaps have told quite another story. But when he got back to Williamsburg, he found that people looked upon him as a hero and praised his brave and gallant attempt. He was publicly thanked for what he had done, and told to fill up his regiment and march once more against the French. But he knew that such a plan was foolish. "We must not try to fight the French until we are all ready," he said. "When enough men have been raised to make such an expedition wise, you can depend on me. But there is no sense in marching to certain defeat, and that is what an attempt now would mean." So the Virginians set about raising 1,000 men. But when the English officer who was to have charge of the troops said that Washington, not being a regular soldier in the British Army but only an American militiaman, could not be a colonel but only a captain, Washington refused to accept such a command. It was no way, he declared, to treat any man, who had been asked to lead. And rather than be so used, he said, he would give up his commission. And he did, retiring to Mount Vernon, which had been given to him by Lawrence Washington when he died. But the next year things were different. The King of England and his advisers determined to make a stand in America against the French. So they sent over 2 regiments of British troops under command of a brave soldier whose name was Major General Braddock, and told him to get what help he could in Virginia and drive out the French at once. General Braddock came to Virginia with his splendid-looking fighting men. When he had studied the situation there, one of the first things he did was to ask Colonel George Washington of Mount Vernon to come with him as one of his chief assistants, known as an aide-de-camp. Washington at once accepted. He saw that now the King of England meant business, and that, if General Braddock were as wise as he was brave, the trouble in the Ohio country might be speedily ended and the French driven out. But when he had joined General Braddock, he discovered that that brave but obstinate leader thought that battles were to be fought in America just the same as in Europe, and that soldiers could be marched against such forest fighters as the French and Indians as if they were going on parade. This made Washington feel very badly, and he did all he could to advise caution. It was no use, however. General Braddock said he was a soldier and knew how to fight, and he didn't wish for any advice from these Americans who had never seen a real battle. At last everything was ready, and in July 1755, the army, led by General Braddock, marched off to attack the fort which the French had built at Pittsburgh and had named Fort Duquesne. Washington had worked so hard to get things ready that he was sick in bed with fever when the soldiers started. But without waiting to get well, he hurried after them and caught up with them on the 9th of July at a ford on the Monongahela, 15 miles from Fort Duquesne. The British troops, in full uniform and in regular order as if they were to drill before the king, marched straight on in splendid array. Washington thought it the most beautiful show he had ever seen, but he said to the general, "Do not let the soldiers march into the woods like that. The Frenchmen and the Indians may even now be hiding behind the trees, ready to shoot us down. Let me send some men ahead to see where they are, and let some of our Virginians who are used to fighting in the forest go before to clear them away." But General Braddock told him to mind his own business and marched on as gallantly as ever. Suddenly, just as they reached a narrow part of the road where the woods were all about them, the Frenchmen and Indians who were waiting for them behind the great trees and underbrush opened fire upon the British troops, and there came such a dreadful time as Washington had feared. But even now Braddock would not give in. His soldiers must fight as they had been drilled to fight in Europe, and when the Virginians who were with him tried to fight as they had been accustomed to, he called them cowards and ordered them to form in line. It was all over very soon. The British soldiers, fired upon from all sides, and scarcely able to see where their enemies were, became frightened, huddled together, and made all the better marks for the bullets of the French and Indians hiding among the trees and bushes. Then General Braddock fell from his horse, mortally wounded. His splendidly drilled redcoats broke into panic, turned, and run away. And only the coolness of Washington and the Virginia forest fighters who were with him saved the entire army from being cut to pieces. Washington fought like a hero. 2 horses that he rode were killed while he kept in the saddle. His coat was shot through and through, and it seemed as if he would be killed at any moment. But he kept on fighting, caring nothing for danger. And let me just stop and say here, little buddies, he had 4 bullet holes in his coat and bullet fragments in his hair. He, at the end, was the only man left on horseback because the Indian chiefs had told their men that the leaders of the British were on horseback. And so to shoot those leaders first and the army would be in confusion. And they were right. But God had a special plan for George Washington because he intended to found a Christian republic on the shores of North America back in those early days. And he preserved George Washington because he had chosen Washington to lead that new country, first in their battle for independence and then in the founding of their new government. And so, despite the fact that all the Indians were shooting at Washington, God wouldn't let him go down. One Indian chief said years later when he met Washington, he said, "I had many Indian fighters whose rifles knew not how to miss in battle, and I told them to shoot at the men on horseback. And when you were the last one, I fired at you myself many times, but I could not hit you. I have come many miles to meet the young warrior whom the gods would not allow to die in battle. And so what we've got here is the story of a miracle and God preserving General Washington when many of those Indians and Frenchmen were shooting not just at the British soldiers, but specifically at the last man on horseback. So, God had a special plan for Washington. It was a great big plan. And he's got a special plan for you, my little friend. It may be a giant national plan, international plan, we should say, like he had for Washington, or it may be something that'll never make the newspapers. Whatever it is, God has chosen you to do important work for his kingdom. So even if your name isn't George or Washington, always keep that in mind. He's chosen you to do something that's important. Washington tried to turn back the fleeing British troops. He tried to bring back the cannons. And when the gunners ran away, he leaped from his horse and aimed and fired the cannons himself. Then, with his Virginians, that Braddock had so despised as soldiers, he protected the rear of the retreating army, carried off the dying general, and cool and collected in the midst of all the terrible things that were happening, saved the British army from slaughter, buried poor General Braddock in the Virginia woods, and finally brought back to the settlements what was left of that splendid army of the king. He was the only man in all that time of disaster who came out of that fight with glory and renown. After that, you may be sure his advice was followed. When another army was raised, and after 3 years of waiting and preparation, the soldiers at last were ready to go once more against the French, Washington's plans were adopted. His way of doing things was followed out, and he was appointed commander-in-chief of all the forces in Virginia. He did not seek the command, he did not want it, but it was Washington's way never to say no to what seemed to be his duty. "If it is in my power to avoid going to the Ohio again," he wrote to his mother, "I shall. But if the command is pressed upon me by the voice of the country, it would be dishonorable in me to refuse it." That is the way that office should be accepted, and duty looked at by every man and by every boy. And as I have told you once before, that was Washington's way. Once more the British soldiers were sent to Virginia, and with them, marching westward, went Washington and his Virginians. But the English government had learned wisdom through defeat, and things were better done this time. Soldiers were sent to fight the French in Canada, too, and the gallant Frenchmen found their hands so full that they had to give up some of the things they hoped to keep. So when the British and Virginians in the Ohio country came to the fort that they had been so long trying to capture, the French had gone away. And Washington and his men marched into the ruined and smoldering fort, where not many years after the town of Pittsburgh was built. Then he went home again. He was now the leading man in Virginia, and though only 26, he was famous throughout all the colonies as a brave and daring leader, a wise and safe advisor, a cautious and clear-headed man. Soon after his return to Mount Vernon, he married a wife. This was Mrs. Martha Custis of White House, Virginia. She was a wealthy, charming, brown-eyed widow of 26. To her, Washington had become engaged just before his last march against the French. They were married on the 6th of January, 1759. And if any boy or girl wishes to know what a fitting wife to a great man this Virginian woman proved, let them read, when they are older, Washington Irving's long Life of George Washington and his wife Martha. 3 months after his marriage, Colonel Washington took his seat in the Virginia legislature, then called the House of Burgesses. He had been elected a member while with the troops at Fort Duquesne, and when he took his seat, the Speaker, or presiding officer of the House of Burgesses, publicly thanked him for his honorable record in the war. Washington was surprised, but feeling that he ought to say something, he rose to reply. He was never a ready or what is called extemporaneous speaker, so he hesitated and blushed and didn't know what to say. Whereupon the Speaker said, "Sit down, Mr. Washington. Your modesty equals your valor, and that surpasses the power of any language I possess." Which was a very pretty and very just compliment, was it not? Washington and his wife and the two little children of Mrs. Custis, Martha and John Park Custis, John Park Custis, began life at Mount Vernon. The property had grown very valuable. Mrs. Washington was wealthy, and the farmer's son of the Rappahannock plantation was now Colonel Washington of Mount Vernon and one of the richest men in Virginia. Mount Vernon was a real Virginia mansion. It was a large 2-story house with 4 rooms on each floor, a high and broad piazza running along the front, and looked down across the beautiful Potomac flowing past the estate. And I have been there, ladies and gentlemen, and it's still there. They preserved it very, very well because Washington was one of our first national heroes. And it's a beautiful place. They restored a lot of it to the way it was back in Washington's day. Very interesting field trip. And one of these days I'm going to go up there and video it for the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club so you can watch it right after you listen to me read the true story of George Washington, which I'm reading from now. Now, where was I before I got to running my mouth and got distracted? Oh, yeah. Across the river were the fields and forests of Maryland. And all about the house stretched the broad acres of the Mount Vernon plantation. Here, with his dearly loved wife and her children, with a large estate to look after and care for, with health and wealth and friends and the respect of his neighbors and fellow citizens, George Washington settled down, as he thought, to the life of a country gentleman, of which he wrote, "I hope to find more happiness in retirement than I ever experienced in the wide and bustling world." And for a time he did find much happiness there. He loved the busy indoors life and outdoors too. He was fond of riding and hunting, and we hear of his splendid horses, Magnolia the Arabian, and Blueskin, his favorite iron gray, and his hunting horses, Chinkling and Valiant and Ajax. We hear of his dogs, Vulcan and Ringwood and Music, Sweetlips and Singer and Truelove, Forester and Rockwood, and the rest. We read of his riding after the hounds, as it was called, to hunt the black fox or the gray, and how with his huntsman, Billy Lee, he took the field at sunrise, dressed in a short blue hunting jacket, a scarlet waistcoat, buckskin breeches, top boots, velvet cap, and carrying his long-thonged whip. He had some creative names for his dogs. Can you imagine Singer and Truelove and Sweetlips? Mount Vernon welcomed many visitors, for one of the chief rules of a Virginia home in those days was welcome and howdy-do to all. This open hospitality was always part of Washington's nature, and even in his early days the young colonel and his wife had a host of friends. In fact, to be without company was so rare an event that Washington would write down the fact in his diary, and he said that though he owned more than 100 cows, he had to buy butter. Wow, it's a lot of company. He was as strong and healthy as ever. When he was 40 years old, he could throw the heavy hammer farther than anyone else. No man could ride better, none could walk further, none was of a more noble and commanding presence than Colonel George Washington. He kept note of everything that was going on in the colonies and in England. He was a leader in politics and church work. That's something the history books sometimes forget, that he was a strong believer and an active member of his local church. In generous and helpful deeds, and in all that makes a man a good citizen, a kind neighbor, and a faithful friend. And little buddies, isn't that a worthy thing for you to aspire to? Look how they describe Washington. He was a leader in politics and church work, in generous and helpful deeds, and in all that makes a man a good citizen, a kind neighbor, and a faithful friend. If you can live and die in such a way that people consider you a good citizen, a kind neighbor, and a faithful friend, you will have lived well. So, he grew on from young manhood to middle age, and over 15 years lived as a well-to-do country gentleman at Mount Vernon. I'll bet that was a fun life. Then came the events that made America free and made Washington famous. But before that glorious end was reached, there were many dark and bitter days, and many a time that tried the courage, the temper, and the faith of this great and noble man. And he was a great and noble man, little buddies. We live in a day that a lot of people call cancel culture, and the idea seems to be there's no such thing as great and noble people. People that accomplish big things are people like people that play sports, people that make music or whatever. Not people that sacrifice the comfort of home and family to go off and serve their country and serve other people. But George Washington was a great and good and noble man. There are many such men and women in history, and even in American history in particular. And I enjoy so much introducing you to these great people. You know why? Because when we see the lives of great people like Washington, they challenge us to want to live great lives too. I have sometimes said that heroes challenge us to our highest and best, instead of excusing us for our lowest and least. I want to live a great life for God, don't you? I don't want to live a lukewarm, wishy-washy, what they call mediocre life. I want to be a godly man, a patriotic man, a responsible, selfless, giving, serving man. Don't you? Well, it's up to us how we live our lives. Let's try to be like General Washington. Let's try to give up our own pleasures and our own comforts and be always ready to do good works for God and for others. Well, I've got to leave you now, and I hate to do it, but I must remind you, as I always do, put God first in your life. Be a patriotic American and honor your father and mother. So long.
Parents, if your kids enjoyed their visit with Uncle Rick, know that they will love the Uncle Rick Audiobook Club. The Uncle Rick Audiobook Club allows access to dozens more stories, both from history and the Bible, to help your kids learn about godly character. Here's what one parent had to say about the book club. My children love the stories. They make history so interesting. My son says it is because of the details that most textbooks don't include. Uncle Rick is easy to listen to. We love his accents and explanations. Thank you so much for that testimony. If you'd like to learn more about the Uncle Rick Book Club, please join us over at UncleRickAudios.com. That is UncleRickAudios.com. See you there.